HBO wasn't going to be knocking on any DMV doors this year, but they clearly wanted to. That and more today on today's episode of Locked On Commanders.
Your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome into this Tuesday episode of Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast covering the Washington Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day every day. And don't forget, you can subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can continue the conversation over with me on Subtext at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders, where you can go one-on-one with me because I'm your host, David Harrison, at DHarrison82 on Twitter, credentialed member of the media and Washington Commanders beat reporter for Commander Country, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site, covering the Washington Commanders. Here with you every Monday through Friday, except for when I have to go up to the Canadian border on Sundays. Didn't get back till late Sunday night, so no Monday episode this week, but here we are. Tuesday, we will get through Friday. I'm going to be honest with you, more to follow, but I may have to miss Monday's episode next week as well. It's that time of year. Everybody knows it's the dead period, so this is the time where you get asked to do a lot of things. But here with you as many days as we possibly can every week with our everydayers. As always, appreciate your continued support for the show. On today's episode of Locked On Commanders, we're going to discuss the players' off time. What are they doing with their off time? We're going to talk about some roster cut candidates, Phidarian Mathis's recovery, and we're going to start the show by talking about Hard Knocks because it turns out we are not going to have to talk much about Hard Knocks this year. Pro Football Talk reporting on Monday that the New York Jets are getting picked for HBO's Hard Knocks. Mike Florio reported again on Monday, quote, per a league source, the Jets are bracing for the preseason Hard Knocks assignment, despite making known publicly and privately their lack of interest in serving as the focal point of this year's show, end quote. But there is something else in Mike Florio's report that stood out to me that makes me believe the NFL and HBO really wanted the Washington Commanders. Quote, the Jets, Saints, and Bears have made it clear that they do not or they don't want to do it this year. The Commanders, were told, would do it if assigned. We're also told the league prefers to wait until after the sale of the team is finalized and that the Commanders could be this year's in-season option, end quote. Now, that is very, very interesting. So no Hard Knocks for the preseason. It would appear, again, as at the time of this recording that I sat down to record this news is still not officially official. It's still just a report, but I feel like it's a fairly solid report, right? So most likely Aaron Rodgers and the New York Jets are going to be on the preseason version of Hard Knocks, but they're talking about the potential of the Washington Commanders being a part of the in-season Hard Knocks. So still maybe some behind the scenes, a little bit less worrisome because there's a little bit less preseason strategy being given away and all these things. But I think this is very telling that HBO and the NFL, one or the other or both, wanted the Commanders to be the preseason Hard Knocks target. The Commanders sale originally was targeted by us, right? Outsiders. We targeted the league meetings at the end of March for the vote to finalize the sale. Jeff Bezos at the time was really the prime candidate, right? Josh Harris was kind of considered the second place candidate. But we all can kind of hope that the league meetings in March, there would be a vote and the sale would be finalized. Now, fast forward all the way to the end of June, and there's a reported special meeting being organized that could be held July 20th. Also could not be held July 20th, but is expected to be held July 20th. And if all goes well, July 20th will go down as a day of not infamy, but fummy. I don't know what the opposite of infamy. Famously, I don't know, for Washington Commanders fans, as the day that the Dan Snyder era officially comes to an end, exactly 1 week prior to the opening of training camp. And that is the big deal here. Training camp begins July 27th. So even if the sale goes through on July 20th, which we won't officially know until July 20th, we can expect and we can anticipate all we want, but we're not going to really know what's going to happen on July 20th until July 20th. So if the sale goes through in Washington, okay, now you're the preseason team, then HBO would have less than a week. Because understand, this is July 20th. 7 days later, training camp opens, which means you got to be set up and ready to go at least 6 days out, right? So you would have less than a week if you're HBO to set up, to get all your angles, to get all your lighting, and go through the storyboards, go through the roster. Who do you want to focus on? Who do you want to interview? Getting team guidance, right? Remember, the team and the National Football League has a say in what hits the air and what doesn't hit the air. So that's a lot of time that's a very small time to do a lot of logistics. So I think that's why the decision was delayed. Last year, when we found out the Detroit Lions were going to be the preseason Hard Knocks team, that decision came out in March. Here we are, end of June, and we still, again, as of the time of this recording, don't have an official announcement that the New York Jets are actually the team. This is just Mike Florio, Pro Football Talk, saying that he's being told that the Jets are bracing for it. Again, I feel like it's solid, but it's not officially official, right? So all signs point to the league and HBO, it's me, wanting Washington, but wanting the new owners, not Dan and Tanya Snyder, which makes a lot of sense because you're trying to turn a page, not just as a franchise, but also as a league. You don't want to have the risk of Dan and Tanya Snyder coming in. And honestly, look, if HBO shows up with their cameras, Dan and Tanya Snyder, I mean, Dan especially might decide to make a cameo appearance. Now, with that timeline delayed, I think they had to make a move, and they made the right one. If you're looking at Aaron Rodgers, Derek Carr, and Justin Fields, those are the other three teams, the Jets, the Saints, and the Chicago Bears. Which one of those quarterbacks is more made for TV? Obviously, Aaron Rodgers. But is everybody Aaron Rodgers out? I don't know. I think we're about to find out. I would much rather see Sauce Gardner, Garrett Wilson, Coach Saleh. I like Coach Saleh's personality a lot. I'd rather see those guys than see Aaron Rodgers, to be quite honest with you. Now, this also opens the door for Hard Knocks in Washington next year. If they're not the in-season option, which they still could be the in-season option, even if the team makes the playoffs or replaces head coach Ron Rivera, which would technically eliminate them from being compelled to do it, right? So for a refresher, in order to be compelled, you have to have not been on Hard Knocks for, I think, the last 10 years, not made the playoffs the last 2 years, and not have a first-year head coach. So that's why the Commanders can be compelled this year. But if they fire Ron Rivera, if they make the playoffs, which one of those will happen, not both. Well, not both. I mean, I suppose they can make the playoffs and still fire Ron Rivera. I don't think that's going to happen. But they could still, maybe go to Washington, but hey, look, guys, we were going to pick you last year. Do us a solid and volunteer. And Washington could become the second team in the history of this program to actually volunteer. Speaking of volunteers, the NFL did talk to 28 other NFL teams, showing that they clearly didn't want to do the Jets, Saints, or Bears. And I'm wondering if the Jets have already communicated difficulty that Aaron Rodgers is going to give them. There's also the Pat McAfee impact. I mean, every week, Aaron Rodgers is going to go on the Pat McAfee show, theoretically or possibly, and who knows what he's going to say. He might, dog the HBO cruise or something like that. But look, this isn't, a negative for Washington. I know a lot of fans wanted the Commanders to be on Hard Knocks, and I get it. You want an inside view of your team, and certainly that's exciting. And I'm not going to lie, I would watch it too. But for a season like this one with Eric Bieniemy in the house and everything, I think now you can be more open in your planning ability, right? You can do more things in practice than you could before. Fans who have been in attendance at OTAs and minicamp have been pretty good. That when the staff says, "Hey, no more filming, no more live tweeting," stuff like that, I think most of the fans in attendance have done pretty well and adhered to those rules. So players just need to focus on learning and practicing, man. They don't have to worry about the cameras. They don't have to worry about social media and all this other stuff. National media is already pretty low in Washington as well. And I don't know that they'll come away from Hard Knocks with a more positive outlook, because obviously Hard Knocks tries to give a positive spin to every team, right? That makes for good television. I think, honestly, it could make it more of a punching bag. If you see a bad throw or an exasperated look, I think you could turn Washington into more of a national punching bag. Next year, however, this franchise could have a little bit more of a positive spin on the national level. So next year, or even in season, would be a little bit better. So that's the news from Hard Knocks. Some of you are going to be disappointed. Some of you might be a little excited. It is what it is. Well, more to follow on the in-season version of Hard Knocks. We'll see what happens there. But next up, we're going to jump into the mailbag with questions about recovering players, released players, and how the Commanders are spending their downtime before they get ready for training camp. That's all coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you by FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to join today. Currently, the Washington Nationals are 1.5-run underdogs against the Seattle Mariners on Tuesday night, with Jake Irvin taking the mound for the Nats against Seattle's Brian Wu. Or you can stick to football, where the Washington Commanders are 6-point favorites over the visiting Arizona Cardinals in week 1 of the NFL season, with a -245 odds to win the game straight up. Whatever it is, don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Commanders. Thanks again for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. And every day is a special thank you to you for coming through every day. We have an episode tomorrow. We will be back with more. Look, it's speculation season. It's prognosticating. I don't even know if that's a word season. Projection season. That is the time of year we are in. And then as we hit July, get past the July 4th weekend, we will roll into training camp battles, and all these other things. Of course, if you want to send in your questions for future episodes of mailbag episodes, you can drop them in the YouTube comments, email them to lockedoncommanders@gmail.com, or you can hit me on Twitter or on Subtext at joinsubtext.com/lockedoncommanders. We got a question in from Dave Robb, and his question was, how is Phidarian Mathis' recovery looking? Is he working with the team or still rehabbing? I haven't heard much about him so far. Well, you haven't heard much about Phidarian Mathis because there's just not a whole lot to talk about with Phidarian Mathis right now. The defensive line, just like the offensive line, can't make a lot of contact, can't really hit anybody, can't be throwing people around. You're not wearing pads. You're not pursuing and tackling. So that's why you're not hearing a lot about him. You're also not hearing, you're hearing a lot about Chase Young because he's the star player with the fifth-year option situation and all the Montez Sweat's in a contract year. Deron Payne is a big name. Jonathan Allen's a big name. But, you're not hearing about the guys like Phidarian Mathis. You're not hearing about John Ridgeway, who is still working back from an injury because they're just not these marquee players. But Phidarian Mathis, for what it's worth, has been participating in practice. He's been participating in the reps. I haven't necessarily trained an eye on Big Phil just because of the limitations of what we can really evaluate right now at this stage in the offseason program. But he does look like he's fairly healthy. I did have a second to talk to him. He actually went to the podium after one of the mini camp practice. It might have been an OTA practice. I don't know. He went to the podium at one point in time, did a presser. So, said he was feeling good and stuff. And I got to talk to him. I was talking to him in back before he went up to the microphone, and we were just kind of shooting the breeze, you know what I mean? And he says he's feeling good. Certainly looks good, looks nimble, all those things. We're also talking about some other stuff. But, I'm very excited for what Phidarian Mathis is going to do this season. I think that he's a guy, if you go back to last year, I didn't know a lot about him when he got drafted, just being transparent. You can't know every prospect. I don't cover the draft year in, year out. So basically once the Commanders season is done, that's when I start diving into prospects. Phidarian Mathis wasn't one of the guys that I really dove into, but once I did, certainly liked what I saw. I thought he was a little big, little tight, you know what I mean, in his movements. But once he got to rookie camp, once he got to the OTAs, mini camps, training camp, dude looked fluid, man. He looked nimble on his toes, looked a lot better than, I don't want to say better because he didn't look bad, but looked a lot lighter on his feet, I would say, than I expected him to. Was really excited for his rookie season, man. Really thought that he could be a guy who could contribute as a rotational player, and then unfortunately got injured. In that first week against the Jacksonville Jaguars, everybody in the press box, man, when we saw, you see the player go down, and your heart always drops a little bit, but then you go into, you have your work, you have your job, right? You got to report what's happening, pull out the binoculars, man. And as soon as you see this Phidarian Mathis on the ground, your heart breaks for the kid, So had the opportunity to talk to Phidarian at the end of last season. He was there on locker cleanout day. Nothing on the record, but just kind of hanging out, just shooting the breeze with him there in the locker room. Said then that he was feeling a lot better. They still learned a lot, just from being around the guys, being in the NFL meetings and all that stuff. So, you're not going to hear a lot about him until the pads come on, unfortunately, just because of that. But if you guys want me to, look, I will set some time up with Phidarian. Not during vacation. I know there's some shows and there's some media members and look, there's nothing wrong with it, that are getting these guys on their shows and stuff during this portion of the offseason. And those guys, some of them want to do it, and that's perfectly fine too. I prefer to leave guys alone during this vacation time because they've got, a very long stretch ahead of them. So I prefer to leave them alone. But once we get to training camp, it's game on, right? They're coming off the field for practice. So if you guys want me to hit up Phidarian on the record, on camera, I will do so for you. And I will certainly, I can make him the first guy I look for on July 27th if you want me to. If you really want me to hit him up earlier, let me know too. And I will, I'll probably do it like July 20th. You know what I mean? Give him till the last week, that final week. He's probably not really on vacation anymore. He's probably kind of transitioning into go mode. So if you want me to reach out to Phidarian, let me know. And I will certainly see if I can get him on the program. At worst, I'll hit him up after practice, one of the early days of training camp, and let him tell you himself how he is feeling. So I appreciate the question. I appreciate the concern for the player, to be quite honest with you. I like when fans show some some legit concern for a player and curiosity about how the player himself is doing. So I appreciate that question. Looking forward to what Phidarian Mathis puts on the field this season. Next question comes from Keith. My most active. I usually say maybe, but I think at this point, Keith, you are my most active subtexter, and I greatly appreciate. I appreciate all the subtexters. Don't get me wrong. If you want to become a part of that community, again, it's just joinsubtext.com/LockedOnCommanders. First 2 weeks is free. After that, for a small monthly subscription, you and I can go back and forth about Commanders football. Keith sends me a lot of things, and he's big fan of Ben Standig, which I'm a big fan of Ben Standig. So Keith is. So I greatly appreciate it. And Keith, I actually told Ben that you sent me a lot of his work on Subtext, and he was very very touched by that. So he appreciates that as well. So Keith wrote me and said for Tuesday, these are the 6 players that I have not making the team. I don't know about cap space changes, but my picks are Troy Apke, Rashad Wild Goose, Dejon Harris, Milo Eifler, Tyler Larson, Dax Milne. And Keith says I could write my reasons, but I'm interested in your opinion. Thanks. So here's my opinion on all these guys. Troy Apke. First and foremost, Troy Apke, man. Commanders fans, you either love Troy Apke or you hate Troy Apke. I've never had a bad interaction with Troy Apke, so I have nothing bad to say about the guy. He looks like a depth guy to me. He looks like a guy that, honestly, with the talent that's on this roster, I don't see him making the active roster. That he could be kind of like what he was last year, might bounce from the practice squad into free agency, back to the practice squad, stuff like that. But Troy Apke just kind of is who he is. So I certainly would not be penning him or penciling him in either to your 53-man roster projections, but there's something this team obviously likes about him. Now, again, injuries could happen, knock on wood they don't, but if they do, then you can potentially see a guy like Troy Apke cap. Rashad Wild Goose is a guy that I will admit I wasn't thoroughly impressed with him, in his gameplay. Not really all that impressed with what I see in practice, but the coaches who know more about this than I do certainly seem to like him. He is getting some reps mixed in with the ones, not saying he's getting first team reps per se, but they mix these guys in from time to time. So take that, with that kind of qualification to it. So Rashad Wild Goose, certainly not the bottom of the barrel cornerbacks, certainly not the top, but he is a guy that this team's giving some good burn to in practice. We'll see how that develops through training camp, and if he starts getting knocked down a little bit. Again, nothing overtly bad about him, right? Just not anything super impressive either. And I feel like with Danny Johnson, with Jeremy Reeves, with Quan Martin now on the roster, I just don't know where Rashad Wild Goose fits in. So he will most likely, if I continue to see what I've always seen from him, will most likely be on my projected list of cuts, but doesn't mean that he will actually get cut. The 2 linebackers, Harris and Eifler, both these guys can make the roster. Both these guys could get cut. Really, it's going to come down to special teams. There's not a huge need for linebackers on this roster with Cody Barton and Jamin Davis taking up the top 2 spots. Really, you could see this team rolling with 3 or 4 at the most linebackers. David Mayo being one of them, Khaleke Hudson or Milo Eifler are kind of my 2 guys jockeying for that 4th position. Harris, I don't know. It would take this team keeping a good amount of linebackers for special teams. Last year, they had 6 linebackers on the initial 53. Special teams coordinator Nate Katzer confirmed to me that they had so many linebackers on that initial 53 because of special teams, not because of defensive things. But this season, guys like Chris Rodriguez Jr. are out there. We had a conversation not too long ago about fullbacks potentially if Alex Arma gets a spot on special teams and as a potential fullback on this team. So, a lot of things could potentially happen. I think Harris is probably on the outside looking in. Milo Eifler is kind of on that bubble, depending on how many linebackers they decide to keep. Tyler Larson, the veteran offensive lineman center, certainly a guy that I think is on the bubble, especially with the draft picks that they made. But they could decide to keep 3 centers, true centers on the roster this year. If they do, then I think Tyler Larson makes the roster. It's going to come down to math at the end of the day. Dax Milne is a guy, his position is legitimately in jeopardy, guys. I talked to special teams coach, coordinator Nate Katzer about this, and I point blank asked him, I said, look, a lot of us on the outside, fans, media, we look at Dax Milne and say, this could be the season he doesn't make the active roster, and he's being challenged by Kazmir Allen at a minimum, Mitchell Tinsley as well, the undrafted free agent from Penn State. He's got some punt return experience, not a lot, but a little. And I asked him, is that legit, or are we, off base here? He said, no, that's legit. There's competition there. And if you can't provide offense and, if you get beat out on special teams, that could be your job. I don't think Dax Milne outside of, you look at Terry McLaurin, Curtis Samuel, Jahan Dotson, De'Ami Brown, and Marcus Kemp. I think those are your top 5 wide receivers coming into training camp right now. If they keep a 6th, you're going to need to bring that special teams ability. So Kazmir Allen and or Mitchell Tinsley can take over that special teams role. Then I think Dax Milne's spot on the roster certainly in jeopardy. So good list there. I think really the 2 that I would say that have a better chance of making the 53-man roster over the rest are Rashad Wild Goose, just because of the trends, and Milo Eifler. But certainly a good list of bubble guys there from you, Keith. So I appreciate that. We've got one more question coming from the mailbag from Bill coming up next, and that's going to be about running backs, free agent running back options coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders. Dave, Rob, and Keith both came through with really good questions here on this mailbag episode. We're going to round it off with Bill, who asks, always interested in team instructions to players to keep them in football shape, both mentally and physically, like during upcoming 6-week hiatus before July practice training camp. Are there stretches or exercises the team suggests, or an athlete or are athletes left on their own? Do they get to study film through a Washington employees only website, or are they restricted? Can they ask football questions of their coaches during the hiatus, or is this banned by the NFLPA? So really kind of a three-parter there question for Bill. I think it's a really good question. And this almost, Bill, you almost got me to violate kind of my own rule of leaving players alone during this break that they get. Again, it's not every player is necessarily looking for the break, but I kind of just internally just kind of trying to leave them alone for the most part. And I was actually going to wait to answer this question until later in the process and maybe get a couple of guys to answer this question for me. But I know enough of this. If you want a more player-centric answer, Bill, by all means, remind me when we get to like mid-July, and I will readdress it with actual players. But here's just from what I know, just from talking to guys just in the past or just understanding the business. Suggested workouts and stretches. Yes, these coaches, absolutely. The trainers, the strength trainers, the nutritionists, everybody who can give these guys advice, especially the young guys, like Terry McLaurin, you know what I mean? Is he getting a lot of like stretching, tips? No, he's not. But like Jahan Dotson probably still is a little bit, Emmanuel Forbes certainly still is. They're getting, I call it homework. It's not really homework, but it's kind of like homework. But there's actually a really funny story that I remember from Rob Gronkowski during his time with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Part of his contract to get his offseason workout bonus. And I don't know if this was between OTAs and training camp or this was before, but regardless, it was during a stretch where there were no official team activities, right? He was told to send picture or a video of him working out to the Buccaneers, one of the Buccaneers trainer, X amount of times a week or whatever it was. I don't remember exactly what it was. Gronk wanted to go on vacation. And he was going to be active. He's going to work out, during the vacation, but he didn't want to have to like schedule his workouts. He didn't want to have to like, go through the formality of it. He wanted to just chill and be Gronk. So what he did is he took a day and did like 6 or 7 wardrobe changes during one workout, videoed them all, and then just during his vacation, basically went to the archive and sent out some of the videos. So that's kind of a funny story. But yeah, but players, yes, if they need to, whether it's contractually or they're young, if they need to have guidance or workout plans, they have them and they know what to do. But also they're adults, they're professionals, so there's a little bit of expected. So it's kind of a yes and a no. Like, yes, they're giving advice, yes, they're giving guidance, but they're also grown men and they're expected to be able to do this stuff on their own to a certain extent as well. Film study, yes, they can do film study while they're away during this stretch of time. Some team, I can't speak for every single team, but some teams have secured websites, kind of like what you mentioned. They're not like WashingtonCommanders.com player access, but there are some we get access to them during like Senior Bowl weeks, and some people who are really connected to like collegiate programs will get access to them through the collegiate portals and stuff like that. Technically, I'm not encouraging, but technically, if you're like a really smart hacker, you could actually get into them yourself. But they're secured sites. They have passwords, and yes, there's some film, some cut-ups, stuff like that put in there. Plus, they have the iPads. The iPads have playbooks. So that's why anytime you hear about a player's car getting broken into, the first question the team wants to know is, where was your iPad? Don't leave it in your car. Stuff like that. So they've got playbooks, they've got film, they can watch, they can do all that stuff. And if I'm not mistaken, they are allowed to go to the team facility. That's their office. You know what I'm saying? It just can't be mandated. There can't be any official activities, but like if they want to go to the film room, again, don't quote me on that because I'm not 100%, but I believe that if they want to go to the team facility, they're allowed to do so as their office. As far as asking coaches questions, that part I'm not clear on. So I'm not confident enough to give you a yes. Like the going to the team facility, like I said, I'm pretty sure they're allowed to do that. So I will tell you a soft yes on that. Whether or not they're actually allowed to contact the coaches and ask them like, hey, coach, I was watching this cut up of film. What do you think on this route or something like that? I don't know that they can do that, but I don't know if they can't do that either. What I do know is they can't have any official meetings. And if a player has a question, I would think that according to the CBA, it would have to be the player asking the coach. You know what I'm saying? Like the coach couldn't call the player and say, hey, man, just want to make sure you're diving into your playbook and doing all this stuff. the player would have to contact the coach. If I was a player, and if I was on the players union, I would want my players to have the ability to reach out to their coaches and say, hey, can we do this? But again, I'm not 100% sure on that. So again, if you want me to bring this up, Bill, to players as we get closer to training camp or even into training camp, just remind me and I will certainly do it. You're gonna have to re-ask the question because I keep track of all these questions, but I do delete them once I answer them. So you will have to re-ask the question, but I will certainly be willing to do that for you. It'd be a lot easier on Subtext, just being honest with you. Another great mailbag, everybody. I appreciate you guys bringing the great questions every single week. Commanders fans always bring the heat. If you have questions that you want to add to it, just throw them in the YouTube comments, hit me up on Twitter, or email them to lockedoncommanders@gmail.com or send them directly to me. The easiest way to do it via Subtext at joinsubtext.com. As always, thank you so much for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day. Thank you for coming through like you do on a consistent basis. And subtexters, make sure your contact information is up to date with me because I am going to be starting some subtext giveaways coming up here in the near future. I've been working with our Tegna legal offices about this, and we are going to start doing some giveaways. I've got some ideas I want to give back to you all a little bit. So subtexters, be on the lookout for that. If you want to get in on that, again, join subtext.com/lockedoncommanders. As we get through this and into training camp and all that stuff, you're going to get a lot of on-site stuff, bonus videos, all kinds of cool stuff. Plus, you can just shoot the breeze with me the way that I do every once in a while with Big Phil, because he's a great guy to talk to. Thank you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine. And if you have anything else Washington Commanders related you want to know or want to discuss, make sure you also follow me on Twitter at dharrison82. Until we speak again, be safe, be kind, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.